Welcome to the Redmond Historical Society's Saturday Speaker Series program, The Razor's Edge, the Washington Razor Clam Phenomenon with author David Berger. I'm Holly Turner, the host for today's program. Thank you for joining us for our third hybrid program. We're glad to have you with us today in person at the Old Redmond Schoolhouse or online. For those of you on Zoom, please confirm that you can see and hear us using the chat button. Click at the bottom of your screen to open the chat window. You can then select who you would like to send the message to by clicking the drop-down next to To. Type your message and just press enter to send it. We'd also like to know, how did you hear about this program? And who is listening with you today? And how many of you have ever gone clamming on the Washington coast? We will have a Q&A session at the end of today's program. Please use the chat to send us any questions or comments you would like to share. And for those of you attending the program in person, please hold your questions until the end of the program. Now, before we get started, I'd like to introduce Vice President Laura Lee Bennett for a few words about the Society. Good morning, Laura Lee.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? All right. Thanks, Holly, and welcome everyone to the third program of our fall 2000. Sorry. Okay. Hang on. Feedback. Try that again. Is that better? Okay. Restart. Thank you, Holly. Welcome everyone to the third and final program of our Saturday Speaker Series. Up. Try that. Okay. Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you join us. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to give a big shout out to the Lake Washington School District for letting us use this room, our volunteers for the society and today's program. Thank you, Joanne Potter. How are we doing? Okay, I'll just keep going. Yes. Before we continue, I'd like to read the Ancestral Lands Acknowledgement. The Redmond Historical Society acknowledges that we are on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples who continued to steward these lands and waters as they have since time immemorial. We recognize Washington's tribal and indigenous or native organizations, which actively create, shape, and contribute to our thriving communities. The Historical Society is committed to doing our part to engage with and amplify the sources and stories of Native peoples and tribes. I'm going to talk just a little bit about David Berger and then turn it over to our speaker today. David has worked as a visual artist written for the Seattle Times. He's been an executive director of a botanical garden and as a communication officer for, Dunhuang, a World Heritage Site on the Silk Road of China. He is also a Metcalf Fellow for Marine and Environmental Reporting. David started razor clamming when he moved to Washington State after graduating from college. Answering the many questions generated about razor clam lore, history, and biology led to writing the book, Razor Clams, Buried Treasure of the Pacific Northwest, which is for sale today after the program. David was on the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau roster a few years ago, and he has offered this talk about razor clams all across Washington State. Today, David brings us an updated version of this history of razor clams, a source of food, commerce, and tribal identity, and a lesson in shellfish treaty rights. The historic bivalve has become such a passion project that the author is working with a group to make the razor clam the state clam. Please welcome David Berger.
How does that sound now? Better? Okay. Very abundant for the Zoom audience. We're talking about the history of Redmond, which I just had the wonderful experience of taking a tour of the collection here at the Redmond Historical Society, and how things have changed here at this one location, from early history with the Native peoples to the pioneering days. And then as things went along, there was logging, and then agriculture, and then chicken farming, and now Microsoft. So, but through all those kinds of changes in one particular landscape, razor clams have a different trajectory. They've stayed the same on the coast, and that experience of abundance of a natural resource is something that's kind of unique and stays with us right here to the present. So that's one of the important themes of today's talk, the idea of abundance and how that's continued with us. Razor clams are a way to look at a lot of different things. In the journalist business, we call that a keyhole. It's a way to look at a lot of different kind of issues. You can look at biology, sociology, commercial development, linguistics. There's a lot of different things that you can look at. And it's really been fun for me in the course of becoming fascinated with razor clams to learn a lot about the history of Washington through the prism, through the keyhole of razor clams. And organizations like the Redmond Historical Society have been a huge help for me as I began my journey to learn about razor clams, because there it really is not much written about it. And my book is really the first book to tackle the history of razor clamming in this state and in the Northwest. So I relied on primary resources to a great extent. And that meant going to small historical societies around the state, but mostly on the coast, and delving into their resources. Files with typewritten notes from 100 years ago. Treasure trove, that's what gets you really excited to run into stuff like that. And of course, also the special collections at the University of Washington, and many interviews. So my personal trajectory was, I didn't know anything about razor clams when I first came out here. I just stumbled upon it by accident. I actually found a shovel, and we have one gentleman in the audience who has brought a shovel today. I bought that at a yard sale for 25 cents, a shovel pretty much exactly like that. Didn't really know what to do with it, and went with a friend, and we somehow found our way at the coast, got up at 4 in the morning, stumbled to the beach in the dark. And I just couldn't believe it when I actually walked out to the beach and saw literally hundreds of people stretched up to the beach, north and south, holding lanterns, razor clamming. I just found that it was aesthetically beautiful. And secondly, it was just like unbelievable. What is going on here? And we did not do very well that day. In fact, I'll confess that between the two of us, we only managed to catch one clam. And we dug, though, I don't know, lots of holes, and we were very tired. I also was wearing a wool sweater. And I can just advise you right now, a wool sweater is not the thing you want to wear when you go razor clamming, because at the end of digging in the sand and the salt water, the sleeve of that wool sweater hung down to my ankles, and it looked like an elephant's trunk. That was the end of that sweater. Okay. Let's begin the presentation. And this is a typical scene that you might see at the beach, at the ocean. I guess I should ask, how many people here have been razor clamming? Great. For most, about half the audience, maybe a little more, have been razor clamming. So I'm sure some of these will elicit memories. And if I've got anything wrong, please hold it to the end of the talk. Okay. Okay, Hallie, this is not advancing for me. Let's see. Hallie, I hope you are. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Don't know why that wasn't working. Just her mere presence caused it to get fixed. So razor clamming in Washington, it's a story of nature, abundance, as I mentioned, and identity, and a lot of people. So old people, young people, families, it's a family activity. And this is serious people like this gentleman who's digging at the surf with a shovel. And not so serious people like these two women who have a child between them, or maybe they just dug them up in the sand, I'm not sure. Basically, all ages and all ethnicities armed with every weapon conceivable against the inoffensive clam. And because so many people do go razor clam, and because actually it's challenging for different reasons, it's physical, but it's still, you have pretty good success. And you get young children, you get people on dates, you get 80-year-olds who've been razor clamming all their life, because all those people go to the beach every year in tens of thousands, by the tens and thousands. I call it the people's clam. And this is a modest version of what they look like. Siliqua patula, the razor clam, the Pacific razor clam. Let me see if this will work here. There. That's the neck. And then it has a foot. Wow, this thing just is very sensitive. I just touch it and it likes to advance. Here's a mess of razor clams. You're typically allowed 15 razor clams to a limit. So that would be 2 limits. It's actually a very beautiful animal too. So maybe I'll talk about. But we have a variety of clams in Washington state. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes. We've got these small clams, these manila clams, people tend to call steamers. We've got the large gooey duck clam. And we have the razor clam, which is just right. Not too small, not too large. They do have a very powerful foot. That's the neck, as I mentioned. That's the foot. And the shell is fairly thin and it's streamlined. You can take a look. I brought some shell samples here for you to look at. And the foot, the foot is very powerful. This clam was literally just taken out of the sand a moment ago. That's my hand. And the foot expands. You can see it's like an axe shape. And it secures itself into the sand with that and actually digs up and down, because these are clams that actually move. So it's sport, as the diggers here well know. You have to hunt these clams and dig for them, and it's sport. And that muscle is really very strong. And of course, there's no bones. It's an invertebrate. But if you picture like an elephant's trunk and how mobile and nimble and strong it is, a clam's foot is not unlike that. It's very nimble, it's very strong and powerful. And so you can have little tugs of war with the clams to try and get them out of the sand. So clams are dug when there's a low tide and whenever there's a good clamming tide. So if that can be night, that can be early morning, just as long as there's a good low tide, which exposes the intertidal habitat, which is where the razor clams live. So I'm giving you some background on the razor clams and how they're hunted and a little bit about the biology like that before we get into more of the history and some of the other significant aspects of razor clamming throughout the decades in this state. So what do you look for at the beach? Well, they appear as little shows. So they can be a big clam show like that big hole, or very, very subtle like that little dimple, which you can only see because the light is slanted. Sometimes they don't show at all. No one really knows why. You can go to the beach and for the love of God, you know there are thousands of clams down there and you can't find a single one. And at other times, they jump in the net. So however you get them, they typically end up on the dinner plate, sometimes simply sauteed, other times ground up and made into a kind of fritter like this item here. So razor clamming has flourished for a long time in Washington. As I mentioned, it's a way to understand our history. It's a way to understand our identity and our relationship to nature. Because of that, I sometimes call it the other salmon. So that's my other nickname to it. So besides the people's clam, I call it the other salmon, because it does occupy for thousands and thousands of people a special place in their psyche. We had to have some furnace work done the other day, and 3 young guys, and one of the young guys spotted the razor clamming book, and he got so excited. And right away, the story is he grew up, his uncle was a consummate outdoors person and went crabbing and salmon fishing, but took this gentleman razor clamming all the time. And that was his favorite thing. And he loves to dig razor clams. He loved going out to the beach and he loved eating them. So people tend to remember, and I would be surprised if people in the audience here didn't have their own stories about the first time they went razor clamming or going razor clamming with such and such a person or taking their children to go razor clamming. It has that kind of hold on people, on the psyche of people here. And so that's part of the history, part of our identity, and part of our relationship to nature. Tends to be overshadowed by salmon, but it has a similar place. So where are they found? You can see in this map that they're found along the west coast of the United States. That's the only place in the world they're found. They're endemic to our part of the world, the Northwest. They're especially abundant here in Washington State. We are essentially the epicenter of the razor clamming phenomenon. They are found in abundance up in Alaska with a lot of coastline, but Alaska coastline is not easily accessible. I mean, essentially you need a boat. While here you can just drive a couple of hours and you're at the coast ready to razor clam. This is a little bit more of a detailed picture of our coast. They are only found on sandy beaches. So they're not found in the north part of the state where the beaches are more gravelly. Basically, those sandy beaches were all created from the outflow from the Columbia River, spreading north and south and creating those sandy beaches. And that's the preferred habitat of the razor clam. So they're not found in Puget Sound. They're only found on the coast. They're only found in places where the surf crashes down. So now, why are razor clams so significant? I go through this by the vowels as a kind of mnemonic device. So A, they're very abundant. And by abundant, I mean, every time you go to the beach, you get your limit. Wow. And there's hundreds of people walking off the beach with a limit. Thousands and thousands of clams come off the beach on a dig. And whoa, there's a dig the next day. And there's thousands of people at the beach again. And they dig and fill their nets and come off the beach with thousands and thousands of clams. That goes on throughout the year or throughout the season. And then you think, well, my God, I'm not going to be there next year. We dug all the clams out, but they're there again next year. Now, there are some other aspects to the story, and there have been some moments when they've seemingly been overfished, or there have been other reasons when the resource is a bit in decline. But overall, they're super abundant. And nowadays, we are much more accustomed to a rhetoric, I guess you'd say, of absence. We've cut down all the trees. I used to be able to walk the big trees. We used to be able to walk across the rivers on the backs of the salmon to hear the reports. No, we don't have that anymore. Oh yeah, the passenger pigeons that darkened the sky for 3 days. No, we don't have that anymore. And oh, look at this report. So many animals extinct around the globe. We're having another extinction episode in the history of the world. Well, those are all very depressing stories. And the razor clam story, I'm thankful to say, is currently different than that. It's a story of abundance. And so you go to the beach and you have that particular experience, which is kind of unusual and uplifting for me, and I think for other people. There's a lot of joy at the beach, a lot of happiness as people fill the net. And it seems to answer something very human to gather food from nature directly, bring it home and dress it and cook it all maybe in 12 hours. So they are excellent eating. I would argue they're the best tasting clam in the world. Other people agree. Some people say they are more like rubber bands with a little flavor, but you can be assured that they overcooked their clams. But they are excellent eating, and they're good just sauteed, made into chowder, fritters, or however you prefer to prepare them. They have been a source of income for different people in different ways. So in the very early part of the European settlement, you could go into a store and plop down some razor clams there on the coast and pay for your groceries that way. Later on, around the turn of the last century, a guy figured out how to can them. And so razor clams were dug and canned and sold for about 50 years. And canned razor clams became basically a kitchen staple. They were occupied the role that we might consider canned tuna fish. Basically, they were as ubiquitous as canned tuna fish is now. And people would open up a can of canned razor clams and make razor clam chowder. After World War II, So it provided a lot of income for diggers, for the canneries. It was even advertised nationally in places like Ladies' Home Journal. And eventually, though, for different reasons, that petered out, and the recreational fishery became more commercially important than the sale of razor clams. And after World War II, the recreational fishery took over, which is the dominant use of the resource now. And it's only here. This razor clam is not found anywhere else in the world. There are other clams that are called razor clams on the East Coast. There's a thin clam that looks a lot like a jackknife. There are some clams in Europe that they call a razor clam. But overall, the Pacific razor clam only found here. And it's a very meaty clam. As you saw from the picture of the shell, it only takes two clams make a meal, 3 clams. Maybe you can cram in 4. So they're only found here. So they're endemic and unique to our Pacific Northwest. And you have to catch them. You can't go to the store to buy Pacific razor clams. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is they don't behave quite the same way as other clams, so they don't keep quite as well. But also, they can't be commercially raised. They don't farm raise. So gooey ducks are farm raised. Razor clams are not. So really, the only way that you can enjoy the razor clam is by going out there and getting into the outdoors and digging them yourself with a shovel or a tube or even with your hands. So I think that's an important component of the experience of razor clams. And sometimes why? Part of a way of life, especially for the coast, razor clamming is a way of life. So certainly for, let's say, any people on the coast, the coastal tribes, razor clams are a staple food, really for anybody, most people on the coast, but especially for the coastal peoples. I mean, to have razor clams weekly would not be unusual. And most people on the coast, razor clam, have their favorite ways of preparing the food, put razor clams in the freezer, and going to the beach and digging razor clams is part of what they do. And I have many friends that they live in Seattle or whatever in the state who always go razor clamming every year. It's a family activity, and they go once, twice, 3 times a year. It's a very important family outing and activity. And I have some other friends, they live in California now, and the family's spread out all over, but every year they go to have a reunion at the coast and dig razor clams for 3 days, rent a little cottage and have a family reunion and dig razor clams. So these are the kind of activities that are associated with razor clams, and why I call it sometimes like the other salmon, about bringing people and families together. So for all those reasons, that the thing is cutting it off the very top, but that makes razor clams and razor clamming iconic, and sometimes literally iconic, like this razor clam sculpture that was at Ocean Shores for many, many years. And one time around Christmas, it disappeared, and it was stolen. And they always thought it would be returned or ransomed and returned, but it never was. And so what happened to it is still the subject of much speculation. It's not a lightweight object, a solid wood razor clam. And people in Ocean Shores are still missing this razor clam. And not all that long ago, the Museum of the North Beach put out a plea: whoever has this razor clam, please return it, even though this was now more than 50 years ago. They're hoping it's in somebody's garage. And a city council person there wanted this or another razor clam sculpture to be put in their new roundabout. But not to be outdone, Long Beach has their own sculpture. Here they have their spurting razor clam, if you can see that little bit. And if you put a quarter in the little gizmo there, it will spurt for you. And the giant cast iron pan that was the original pan that they cooked the giant razor clam fritter in during a festival. Now it's rusted and repaired with fiberglass, so it can't be used for cooking, but it's an important or fun place to stop and take a picture. So, I mean, what lobster is to Maine or blue crabs are to Chesapeake Bay, or somehow that's a similar idea to how the coast has taken to the razor clam as a source of identity. But icons don't have to be large. And here is some razor clam jewelry, pins and whatnot from for different things. And actually, I don't know, is anybody wearing any razor clam jewelry today in the audience? Because sometimes people put on their razor clam regalia before they come to a lecture. Not today? Okay. I always enjoy seeing the razor clam earrings and brooches. And the one at the top there, that razor clam is wearing a fire helmet, a fire hat. Exactly why is not entirely clear, but they do spurt. So the idea is maybe it's like holding a hose or something. Of course, razor clams were bigger in the old days. And even though they're still abundant, unfortunately, they don't grow them quite as large as they did way back when. But folks still have a good time in the 1970s, 80s, as this photo shows, digging for razor clams. In fact, in 1979, there were nearly 1 million razor clam digger trips. That's a lot of people, and that's digger trips, which is a little distinct from number of diggers. So you don't really know the absolute number of diggers, but by what I have figured is roughly it's about 1/3. So it's probably about 350,000 individual diggers. And by the population of the state, maybe about 10% of the state was going razor clamming at that time. There are a couple of ways to dig for them. You can dig with a shovel. The one at the top is kind of a famous shape, the so-called Westport Bend. So because it was an important commercial activity, the tools of razor clamming became an important kind of subgenre, I guess you would say. And because people would go to the beach and harvest razor clams and sell them to the canneries. That's how they made their living. So having the proper tool that would be most efficient was very important. No tool, no shovel that you bought at the store was ever correct. And so people would change the shapes, change the length of the handle, put a different bend in them. And then in the 1950s, the shovel was added to with the development of the tube, the razor clam tube. A gentleman named James Batstone invented the razor clam tube. Now this was all this, by the way, none of this information was really known, or if it was known, it was kind of buried in these historical museums. So it was really fun for me, since you guys are a historical society, I'll just put a little aside. It was such fun to track this down. It was a historical detective story, one of many in the razor clamming story. And I just remember calling the patent office and saying, I'm trying to see if this item could be a patent. And she said, well, what's the patent number? And well, yeah, that's what I'm trying to find out. And you'll just have to go to the patent library at the University of Washington campus and look through shovel implement tools, which no, you can't do that. And but it turns out that someone had been indexing the old patents. So finally, after several searches of various kinds, it popped up on my computer screen, and I literally jumped up and started dancing around my room. But I was very glad to find out who invented the razor clamming tube. which has now supplanted the shovel as the primary device you see at the beach. And I was very fortunate to talk to his daughters and get some photos and whatnot of him. And actually, this is him there and at a little older age. So here are some shovels and tubes at a busy beach, because you do get a lot of people going out there digging especially on the spring tides, when it's usually a daytime dig. And the last few years, I mentioned, have been very good. In fact, the best clamming in 30 years, which is worth mentioning because it does cycle. And when I first started giving this talk about 4 or 5 years ago, we were just ending a very kind of lower period of productivity. We're not the only ones who use the beach, of course. So we love to razor clam, but other people like to harvest at the beach. The migrating birds like to stop off at the beach and refuel and get the worms and things that live in the sand. But even though the beach looks desolate, empty, in fact, as you look at this landscape, there are literally hundreds of thousands of razor clams in that beach. And there are thousands and thousands of little crustaceans and worms that the birds want to eat. And fortunately, they tend to forage at high tide. We tend to forage at low tide, so we can share the beach. So we're not the only ones, of course, who have to share. We also share the beach with the native tribes. And this is a native tribe person fishing. That's a big net he's carrying. That's like they used to use during the commercial days when they would harvest for canning for the canneries. And you can hold 50 or 100 clams in that net, however much you can drag on the beach. And they would drag those up to the wagons, the horse-drawn wagons, and later cars to be sold to the canneries. So I'm going to go a little bit more in depth here about the native tribe fishing rights as they relate to razor clams and read a short excerpt from the book. So just to set the scene, we're a little bit south of the Quinault Indian Nation Reservation. It's on the coast, very desolate. And quote, razor clams are part and parcel of tribal life and a staple food for some, said Ed Johnstone, the Quinault Indian Nation's policy spokesperson. They're guaranteed to appear at festivals and Sunday dinners. In 2013, the Quinn hosted that year's canoe journey, and tribal members dug and froze razor clams for many weeks in preparation. When they welcomed 89 large canoes from 75 tribes, plus thousands of guests, after a paddle journey of hundreds of miles, they served razor clams as part of the celebration and feasting. It was unthinkable not to offer razor clams along with other traditional food as part of the 5-day event. Every August, there's a back-to-school dig for tribal families and kids. The dig takes place over 2 consecutive days, and participants gather on the tribe's reservation beach near Point Grenville. It's a chance to earn money for backpacks, clothes, and iPads in sunny summer weather. The tribe's commercial buy truck is right there to weigh out and pay cash for the clams. For many years, the Quinault people could razor clam only on reservation beaches and off reservation on public beaches with the same recreational opportunities afforded to all state residents. 2 landmark court cases transformed the situation in fishing for everyone in Washington. First came the so-called Bolt decision of 1974, the case of the United States v. Washington, in which U.S. District Court Judge George Hugo Bolt affirmed the right of Washington's tribes to fish for salmon, quote, in common with all citizens in their, quote, usual and accustomed grounds and stations. I'm sure you've heard these words before. That language was from the treaties of 1854 and 1855 concluded by Isaac Stevens, then Superintendent of Indian Affairs and later governor, with more than 20 Indian tribes in what was then Washington Territory. The tribes ceded millions of acres in return for reservation lands and the ability to retain certain rights. Terms were less negotiated than harshly forced on the tribes. Galt, a conservative appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, was tasked with determining what the treaties meant for the modern era. He heard testimony from legal scholars, anthropologists, historians, and tribal elders, and then said that fishing, quote, in common with all citizens meant the opportunity to harvest 50% of the allowable catch, plus the right to co-manage the resource. The ruling created shock and controversy, and I'm sure many of you remember it. Half the salmon, and for its part, the state fought Galt's interpretation all the way to the US Supreme Court, which refused to consider the appeal in 1975. In 1994, 20 years after Judge Galt's landmark decision addressing salmon, US District Court Judge Edward Rafiti presided over another protracted legal battle, a continuation of the original US v. Washington, this time addressing shellfish rights. Rafiti, appointed to the bench by President Ronald Reagan, listened to experts and spent a week touring shellfish beds and commercial operations by plane, van, and boat. Judge Rafiti, like Judge Galt, interpreted the treaty language as the Indians would have understood it at the time. After hearing testimony that the, quote, right of taking fish in the 1850s would have meant harvesting anything that lived in the sea, not only fish, but also clams, oysters, crabs, and marine mammals. Rafiti delivered another shock to fishers and the general public by extending treaty rights to include naturally occurring shellfish on privately owned lands. The crucial treaty paragraph reads, quote, the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary houses for the purpose of curing, together with the privilege of hunting, gathering roots and berries, and pasturing their horses on open and unclaimed lands, colon. And provided, however, they shall not take shellfish from any beds staked or cultivated by citizens. The so-called shellfish proviso, that last sentence in the Stevens treaties, prohibiting Indians from taking shellfish in staked or cultivated beds, reinforced the understanding that the native people had shellfish rights. Why would there be a qualification if the shellfish harvest wasn't there in the first place? I'm sure that's all familiar to many of you. And that case, the Rafiti case, was about oysters in Puget Sound, but it was clearly apparent immediately that the ruling would extend to razor clamming on the coast. And it wasn't long before a fisheries biologist from the Quinault showed up at the office of the Fish and Wildlife on the coast to ask how they were going to get their 50% of the razor clams. So this is what I just read out loud, but you can see it, and the shellfish proviso. And I just was interested to see the original treaty. Surprisingly hard to see them, but perseverance, and there's multiple treaties. This is the Treaty of Point No Point, but it's the Act 4, and these are all what would you call it? Standard language, standard contract. It was developed in the Midwest, and they just adapted it to slapdash the treaties out here. And this Article 4 was just repeated in the multiple treaties. And of course, they didn't have Xerox or typewriters or computers, so everything was handwritten. And I just think it's kind of interesting to see the actual handwritten contracts or treaties. So as we come to the end of the tour, I do like to talk about what a unique environment it is on that western edge of the continent when we go to razor clam, because it's a special experience. And it is very empty. I mean, you don't really see many buildings. If you're not there on a razor clamming day, you don't see very many people. You've got the earth, you've got the water, you've got the sky, the air, and the sun, the fire. And it always feels very Aristotelian to me, like the basic elements of the building block of the universe: earth, sky, water, and fire. And so you can kind of stand there in the water, maybe you're razor climbing, and experience something kind of unusual in that environment. And I do think that's part of the experience and appeal for people of razor climbing, even though they might not quite frame it that way. And here they are enjoying that environment and waiting for the surf to kind of go out and dig razor clams. And I am involved in this effort to make the razor clam the state clam. As I did this research and came to understand the role of razor clams, this tradition, and it's a living tradition because this is going on now. And right now, people are very disappointed because there's a domoic acid closure, a harmful algal bloom closure of the razor clam fishery. And that's disappointing tens of thousands of people who won't be razor clamming for the next few months at least. And but this is a living tradition. And the fact that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people go to the coast every year, the fact that it's a living tradition and part of the way of life for people on the coast, the fact that the native peoples still use razor clams as a staple food, the fact that young people and old people still treasure the memories of razor clamming and the first time they went razor clamming and the people they've gone razor clamming with. All these to me are persuasive reasons why the razor clam should be the state clam, which is an honor for the clam, but also it means that it would be taught in the schools with the other state symbols. And so people, the young people of Washington would come to understand their own heritage. And I think you folks as members of a historical society with interests in the roots of the landscape and place you find yourselves at would appreciate that. So we did have a bill a couple of sessions ago before the COVID, and it actually, the bill passed the House the first time unanimously, the second time with only 4 no votes, and went to the Senate, and it worked its way up through committee. And unfortunately, it never came to a floor vote because I'm sure it would have passed, but it gets stuck in Rules Committee for any of you who enjoy following politics. And then COVID, everyone was kind of preoccupied with other things, but we're hoping to and expecting to have a new bill in the current session. And so I had questions about razor clamming. I started razor clamming, as I mentioned. I went to the beach. My buddy said, "This is not for me. I'm never doing this again." Digging holes in the sand, getting exhausted and not getting a clam. I, on the other hand, was like, I'm going to figure these clams out. This is a challenge. And so I became an aficionado. And ultimately, though, I became more curious, like, why are there so many clams? And other question, how do they dig up and down in the beach? I had questions and there were no answers. So because I'm a curious person, I ended up doing my own research, and that's how I came about to write the book. So thank you. I think we're about on time. I'm not sure. So I guess I'm happy to take any questions that people have on the topic. Okay.
Hi, David. I thought we'd start with some questions from the Zoom. So if any of our folks with us online today can drop any questions in the chat. But I have a couple that I thought we'd get started with. So you mentioned your book, and I know you have it with you for sale today. But for those that are joining us online, where's a good spot for them to find a copy of that book?
Well, it's published by the University of Washington Press, so you can buy it directly from the press, or any bookstore might have it or order it, or your favorite online retailer. also is carrying the book.
Perfect. And speaking of favorites, you mentioned that razor clams often end up on our plates. I was curious if you wanted to share any favorite recipes or any really common ones. I don't think I've had them before, so I'd love any insight.
So there's just a lot to be said about the culinary aspects of razor clams. One thing, because you can't easily go to the store and buy them, you're not going to see them on the restaurant menu. So people are less familiar with them because you just can't order razor clams at the restaurant, if like oysters or gooey duck, which are farm raised. So occasionally you'll see them at the sushi restaurant. There was a time when Ivers served razor clams years ago. So there are ways that razor clams do enter into that system, but it's highly regulated with a lot of health restrictions, and there's a lot of components to bringing food either to the supermarket or to the restaurant. The book does have recipes. Every chapter concludes with a recipe. The recipes are there for two reasons. One is, yeah, it gives you some ideas of ways to prepare razor clams, and that's great. And there's some wonderful recipes. My wife and I worked on them. It was a lot of fun. But more than that, the recipes come from other people, not just me. And so there's a recipe from a historic recipe for clam chowder from, I forget, from the 30s or 40s, which uses canned razor clams, which there are some small purveyors so you can still get those at. I also provide workarounds from some local denizens who live on the coast, from historic cookbooks. So the part of the idea of having the recipes in the book was to show how this food item had permeated the culture and the historical culture. But really, the simplest way is the best way. And so just cleaning the clams, they're less like a steamer clam. They're more like a conch or something. It's a very meaty clam. So it's different from a steamer clam. So you clean them and you have like a piece of meat, and then you saute it briefly, maybe 20 seconds on the side. I'm always for less. My wife is always for about 5 seconds more. A little tug of tussle over the saute pan. Other people like to maybe dip them in egg and panko and pan fry them. Those are the classics. Clam chowder, of course, or razor clam chowder is a classic. I have a couple of pretty good recipes for razor clam chowder in the book. There's also a really good one online from the, I forget the name of the restaurant now. The Seattle Times published it. You can easily find that, a razor clam chowder. I have a very simple razor clam chowder recipe in there where you use canned Campbell's cream of potato soup. Let me tell you, when you've been on the beach with some kids and you're exhausted and you get back to your house or wherever you're staying for the razor clamming and you're cold, because it can be cold at the beach, and you're wet and you're tired, man, you don't feel like doing chopping onions and stuff. You just want to like open a can of prepared potato soup, add some milk, chop the clams, let's eat. So did that answer your question? Thank you for the question.
Yeah, definitely. And it sounds too like in that answer, like sort of the easiest way to get razor clams might be to make the adventure and go digging yourself. So I was curious if you had any recommendations of favorite spots to go, or where somebody who's maybe never gone before would want to start out.
Well, for years and years and years on the coast, there were dozens and dozens of these little motels, and everyone had a beautiful cleaning station where you could clean your razor clams. It was really fun. You need a sink and running water, and that's all. But a well set up clamming kitchen, as they called it, is really a pleasure to use. Usually the cleaning process is you dip the clams, your 15 clams if you have a limit, in some hot water. They spring open and the clam organism falls out of the shell. Essentially, the hot water dissolves the glue that holds the muscle to the shell. and then you clean out the dark spots. And it can take a few minutes, especially if you're not accustomed to cleaning them. And but those hotels and things don't much exist anymore. So a few of the hotels and a few of the motels do provide cleaning stations. And actually there are cleaning stations around, and in some places there are not so much anymore. There used to be like people who had little businesses, will clean your clams for you. And the high school students, they were like really super fat, like, yeah, clean my clams, that's great, well worth it. But basically any place on the coast, ocean shores, Twin Harbors, Long Beach, anytime there's a clamming dig would be a good time to go. People are very friendly on the beach, and the proprietor at your where you're staying would be very happy to tell you suggestions. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife website is very good. They're very good at publicizing when the digs are, and they have videos now how to dig, what signs to look for. It's much easier than it was, let's say, 30 years ago. When I first went, I had to like, that guy looks like he knows what he's doing. Let's copy him and follow him around or ask someone else. You don't have to do any of that anymore. It's all available online. A lot of resources online. So yeah, all you have to, and the season as well. So there are really a lot of digging days now. Spring is the nicest time to go because it's usually a morning tide, and that means you get sunrise while you're at the beach, and maybe it's very nice. Starting on a night dig is maybe a little bit intimidating if you're inexperienced. And so the fall and winter digs are perhaps not the best way to start out, but it's tons of fun. Let's say to go on New Year's Day. The Fish and Wildlife created a new holiday for the state when they started doing digs around New Year's Day, because you get a lot of people that love to go to the beach and celebrate the new year by having a bonfire at the beach and digging razor clams.
We did have one other question. You mentioned that spring might be the most comfortable season to go, but is there a particular season of the year or a season for razor clam digging as far as the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife?
Well, seasons and regulations are complicated and have a long history that has evolved, and the evolution of the regulations is pretty interesting. But as it stands now, first off, there have to be enough clams. There usually are. They do a full inventory of the clams every beach. They come and dig clams over the summer. Every mile, they check the abundance of clams. And they're managed, the beaches are managed according to 5 management areas. And so Long Beach might be open, but Copalis is closed. So you have to check those kind of regulations. It's closed in the summer for a couple of reasons, not least because a lot of people use the beach in the summer and you can drive your car onto the beach. And you don't want to have a bunch of cars and a bunch of people on the beach at the same time. That can be a problem. Also, there's an economic factor because having clammers come to the beach brings money to the coast. Those are some of the poorest per capita areas, counties of our state, and the income that comes from razor clamming, digging is important for those people, and they don't need it in the summer. There's plenty of tourists in the summer, but it helps to have that in the fall and winter. So also the health department checks the clams. They're checking for domoic acid, which is the marine toxins that shellfish sometimes have, paralytic shellfish poisoning or domoic acid. So they're checking, well, basically they're checking all the time. And they're a constant monitoring of the waters so that the shellfish are safe. There have to be 2 consecutive weeks of proper readings before digs are allowed. So many digs are scheduled, and then sometimes occasionally they're canceled. But all this is well documented, usually in the newspaper they report it, and of course on the Fish and Wildlife website. And Usually they put out the anticipated schedule months ahead of time. So you can look and see how many digs are going to be in, let's say, November, December, January, February. And like I said, it was looking to be a banner year this year, but the domoic acid levels are very high. That's what they call a harmful algal bloom. And so the razor clams are filter feeders, like oysters, and they filter out organisms from the water. And if those organisms themselves have a toxin, which they sometimes do for reasons that aren't totally apparent, they can accumulate in the razor clams and then reach a level when they're not safe to eat. But the department is very conservative. So they want to make sure that the weakest members of society are not vulnerable. So the toxic level for domoic acid, for example, is 20 parts per million. And that might be harmful to, let's say, someone who's 85 and not in good health. But anyway, they manage it very conservatively. So you do have to check the regulations for the health closures as well as the seasons.
Well, thank you. I think that covers all the questions we have from our folks on Zoom today. So that does bring us to the end of the Zoom portion of our program, but we will have a little bit more time to take some questions in person today. For those of you that joined us on Zoom, keep an eye out for a link to the recording and along with any resources such as information about David's book and links to information from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll take a few more questions in our audience.
All right.